even before the name Israel resounded through the valleys of the promised land. There was a God forgotten by many, yet present from the very beginning. Have you ever wondered who worshipped Yahweh before the covenant with Abraham, before Moses received the Ten Commandments? The surprising truth is that the God of Israel had worshippers long before Israel existed as a nation. This is the story of those who recognized the Creator when the world was still in its infancy. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Darkness covered the abyss, and the Spirit of God moved over the waters. It was in this primordial setting that Adam, the first man, enjoyed direct communion with his Creator. They walked together in the Garden of Eden in the breeze of the day. This was the purest form of worship, a direct relationship, without intermediaries, without stone temples. Man knew the voice of his God. When Adam and Eve disobeyed the only command given to them, a fracture occurred in that perfect relationship. They hid among the trees, fearing the presence of the one they had once sought. The first sacrifice was carried out by Yahweh himself, who killed animals to cover the nakedness of the couple with skins. There the concept of atonement through blood was born, a principle that would permeate the entire history of worship of the true God. Soon after came the first children, Cain and Abel. In time, Cain offered an offering to Yahweh from the fruit of the ground. Abel, on the other hand, offered from the firstborn of his flock and from their fat. At that crucial moment in human history, we see the first act of worship recorded outside of Eden, a sacrificial offering. Yahweh was pleased with Abel's offering, but not with Cain's. The text does not fully explain why, but the hints suggest it was a matter of the attitude of the heart. That rejection led Cain to commit the first homicide in history, eliminating one of the few worshippers of Yahweh on earth. Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and it came to pass when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. The blood of Abel cried out from the ground, and God heard his cry. Even in that moment of tragedy, God revealed himself as a God who listens, who cares for the shedding of innocent blood. As generations passed, humanity multiplied upon the earth. Yet worship of the true God seemed to diminish. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Only one man remained faithful in his generation, Noah, described as just and upright in his generations, and one who walked with God. This walking with God echoes Adam's original experience in the garden. Noah kept the true worship alive at a time when all humanity had become corrupt. His faithfulness resulted in the preservation of the human race through the flood. After the waters receded, Noah built an altar to Yahweh, and he took from every clean animal and from every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings upon the altar. This was the first altar explicitly mentioned in the Scriptures, marking a development in the history of worship. The aroma of that sacrifice pleased Yahweh, who established a covenant with Noah and his descendants, promising never again to destroy the earth by a flood. This primordial covenant was the first of many that God would make with humanity. demonstrating his desire to maintain a relationship with his creation, despite mankind's continual tendency towards sin. The Tower of Babel represents a crucial point in the history of worship. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top reaches to the heavens. Let us make our name great, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." This was not merely an architectural construction. It was a declaration of independence from God, an attempt at self-glorification, and possibly the birthplace of organized idolatry. The confusion of languages and the scattering of peoples was the divine response to that collective rebellion. From that moment, humanity divided into distinct nations and cultures, each following its own spiritual path. Worship of the true God became even rarer, while diverse religious systems flourished in different regions. It was in that fragmented and idolatrous world that a man appeared who would change the course of the history of worship, Abram, later called Abraham. Born in Ur of the Chaldeans, a Mesopotamian city known for its cultural and religious sophistication, Abram grew up in a polytheistic environment. His own father, Terah, served other gods, as Joshua would later remind the Israelites. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, beyond the river dwell your fathers, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. So how did Abram come to know the true God?" The biblical text does not detail his conversion, beginning the narrative with a call already received. "Now the Lord said to Abram, leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Whatever the manner in which Yahweh revealed himself to him, Abram responded in obedience, leaving behind everything he knew to follow the voice of that God. Abram's journey first took him to Haran, and then to Canaan, where the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." There he built an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. This became a pattern in the life of the patriarch. Wherever he went, he built altars to Yahweh, keeping alive the worship of the true God in lands dominated by Baal, Astarte, and other Canaanite gods. Abram's faith was tested in various ways. During a famine, he went down to Egypt, where he compromised his integrity by lying and saying that Sarah was his sister. Even in that moment of weakness, God protected him and allowed his return to Canaan enriched. On another occasion, after rescuing his nephew Lot from the hands of invading kings, he encountered a mysterious figure. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of the Most High God, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, possessor of the heavens and the earth." This encounter is extraordinary because it reveals that Abraham was not the only worshiper of the true God in his time. Melchizedek, whose name means King of Righteousness, was both king of Salem, later Jerusalem, and priest of the Most High God, Elion, a title of Yahweh. Abraham recognized the spiritual authority of that priest, king, by giving him the tithe of all. This episode shows that God always maintained witnesses of his truth, even in unexpected times and places. The climax of Abraham's life of faith came with the birth of Isaac, the child of promise, and the subsequent test of his willingness to sacrifice him. God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, said Abraham, a prophetic statement that pointed to the final sacrifice that God would one day provide. At the last moment, an angel stayed his hand, and a ram caught in a thicket was offered instead of Isaac. This event on Mount Moriah established a fundamental principle in true worship. God values obedience above sacrifice, and he himself provides the perfect sacrifice. As the line of promise continued with Isaac and later with Jacob, other worshippers of Yahweh emerged in unexpected places. One of them was Job, who probably lived during the time of the patriarchs, although he was not a descendant of Abraham, but a resident of the land of Uz, possibly in the region of Edom. Job is described as a man who was blameless, upright, and who feared God and shunned evil. Job's story is particularly significant because it demonstrates that genuine worship of Yahweh was not limited to the Abrahamic line. Amid intense personal suffering, when he lost his possessions, his children, and his health, Job maintained his integrity and faith. "I was born naked and will die naked. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." The dialogues between Job and his friends reveal a surprisingly developed theology about the nature of God, the problem of suffering, and the question of divine justice. Although his friends represented a simplistic view of cause and effect, suffering as a direct result of sin, Job insisted on the possibility of undeserved suffering. Holding fast to the conviction that God was both sovereign and just, even though his actions might seem incomprehensible from a human perspective. The climax of the book comes when God finally answers Job, not by explaining the reason for his suffering, but by revealing his incomprehensible majesty and wisdom. Faced with that theophany, Job confessed, "I had heard of you by the hearing, but now my eyes have seen you." True worship, as Job discovered, does not consist of understanding all of God's ways, but in recognizing his sovereignty and yielding to it in humble submission. Returning to the line of Abraham, we see Jacob, the deceiver who became Israel, wrestling with his own spirituality. After deceiving his brother Esau and fleeing to Haran, Jacob had a supernatural encounter at Bethel. He dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, whose top reached to the heavens. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And above it was the Lord, who said, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac." Upon awakening from the dream, Jacob exclaimed, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He set up the stone he had used as a pillow and anointed it with oil, making a vow to God. This moment marks the beginning of his personal journey with Yahweh, although his spiritual maturity would only come years later after another supernatural encounter in the valley of Jabbok, where he wrestled with a mysterious being until daybreak. "I will not let you go unless you bless me," declared Jacob, now determined to obtain divine blessing, not by deceit, but by persistence. The result was a transformation in both name and character. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have wrestled with God and with men and have prevailed." Israel means he who struggles with God, or prince with God, a name that reflected his new identity as one who had encountered God face to face and had been transformed by the encounter. The worship practiced by the patriarchs was markedly different from the elaborate religious systems that would later arise. There were no temples, only simple altars erected in significant places. There was no organized priestly class. The head of the family acted as priest for his clan. There was no written code of laws, only the direct guidance of God through dreams, visions, and personal encounters. That primitive simplicity of true worship would be progressively elaborated in later ages as God revealed more of himself and his expectations for his people. The descent of the children of Israel into Egypt marks a new chapter in the history of worship to Yahweh. Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, maintained his faith amid the most adverse circumstances. Even in the Egyptian prison, far from his land and family, Joseph attributed both his gifts for interpreting dreams and the twists of his life to God, are not the interpretations of God. He asked the officials of Pharaoh and later declared to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph's faithfulness in a foreign land not only preserved his own faith, but also ensured the survival of the entire family of Jacob during the severe famine that struck the Middle East. When his father and brothers joined him in Egypt, they settled in the land of Goshen, maintaining their distinct identity as worshippers of the God of their fathers. However, as generations passed and the original patriarchs died, the situation changed drastically. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, according to the book of Exodus. The Israelites were reduced to slavery, forced to work on the construction of the cities of Cult, the cities of Pithom and Rameses. During that period of oppression, which lasted for approximately 400 years, worship of Yahweh appears to have weakened, with elements of the Egyptian religion possibly infiltrating Hebrew practices. The biblical text does not offer many details about the religious life of the Israelites during their stay in Egypt, but there are indications that the memory of the God of their ancestors was not completely lost. When Moses and Aaron presented themselves to the elders of Israel, the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and had seen their affliction, they bowed down and worshipped. This response suggests that, despite the hardships, some knowledge of Yahweh and the promise made to the patriarchs had been preserved, possibly passed down orally from generation to generation, even during the darkest periods of history. God always preserves a faithful remnant, people who keep alive the knowledge of his name and his ways. The first time Moses approached Pharaoh, he delivered a direct message from Yahweh. "Let my people go, that they may hold a feast in the wilderness." This initial request was not for complete liberation, but for permission to properly worship his God, something impossible while they remained in Egypt, where Hebrew rituals, such as the sacrifice of animals considered sacred by the Egyptians, would be seen as offensive. This detail reveals how much true worship had become restricted under Egyptian rule. They could not worship freely, perhaps due to the work demands imposed by the overseers, but also because their religious practices conflicted with Egyptian sensibilities. If we were to sacrifice in the sight of the Egyptians that which they consider an abomination, would they not stone us? Moses asked. Pharaoh's refusal to permit even that temporary act of worship triggered the 10 plagues, each directed against a different god of the Egyptian pantheon. The first plague, the turning of the Nile to blood, attacked Hapi, the god of the Nile. The plague of locusts challenged Serapis, the protector, against those insects. The death of the firstborn was a blow against Pharaoh himself, who was considered divine, and his heir. The plagues were not merely displays of power, but divine judgments against the false gods of Egypt, as God declared, "I will execute judgments against all the gods of Egypt." The climax of that spiritual confrontation came with the institution of the Passover, when each Israelite family sacrificed a lamb, applied its blood on the doorposts, and ate the roasted meat with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. This ritual was not only a means of physical protection against the angel of death, but also an act of worship and submission to Yahweh. A public declaration of fidelity to the true God in a land dominated by idolatry. Finally free from the Egyptian yoke, the Israelites faced a new challenge: relearning how to properly worship the God of their ancestors. 400 years in an idolatrous culture had left deep marks. The knowledge of Yahweh had been preserved, but likely mixed with elements of Egyptian religion and other cults with which they had come into contact. The crossing of the Red Sea was followed by a spontaneous act of worship. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to the Lord: "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. He is the God of my father, and therefore I will exalt him." This song of Moses, one of the oldest poetic texts in the Bible, expresses admiration for the demonstration of divine power and the recognition of Yahweh as a warrior, protector, and deliverer. The journey through the wilderness would prove to be a time of intensive spiritual learning. Only 3 days after the triumphant song, the people were murmuring against Moses because of the bitter water at Marah. This pattern of praise followed by murmuring would be repeated countless times during the 40 years in the wilderness, revealing the spiritual immaturity of a people who, although physically free, still carried the mentality of slaves. In the 3rd month after the departure from Egypt, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, where the defining event of their national and religious identity would occur. There, God proposed a covenant. "Now, if you diligently listen to my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my peculiar possession among all peoples. You shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation to me." The people responded unanimously, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." This initial commitment was followed by an impressive theophany. The entire Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke, for the Lord had descended upon it in fire. Its smoke rose like that of a furnace, and the whole mount trembled greatly. Amidst thunder, lightning, and the sound of an increasingly loud trumpet, Moses ascended the mount to receive the law that would define how the people should live and worship. The 10 Commandments given on that occasion begin with explicit prohibitions against idolatry. "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol." This emphasis on the exclusivity of worship of Yahweh and the prohibition of images reflected both the idolatrous tendency of the people acquired in Egypt and the radically different nature of the true God's cult compared to the religions of neighboring nations. In addition to the moral commandments, God provided detailed instructions on how to construct the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary that would serve as the focal point of worship during the wilderness journey. "And they shall make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them," declared God to Moses. The tabernacle symbolized the divine presence among the people, but it also emphasized God's holiness and the need to approach him only according to the terms he had established. The structure of the tabernacle, with its outer court, holy place, and most holy place, created a gradation of holiness that reflected the distance between the holy God and sinful people. Only the high priest could enter the most holy place, and even then only once a year on the Day of Atonement, bearing the blood of a sacrifice. While Moses received these instructions on the mount, the people demonstrated how deeply ingrained the idolatrous mindset was. Impatient with Moses' delay, they said to Aaron, "Arise, make for us gods that shall go before us." Aaron yielded to the pressure and fashioned a golden calf, proclaiming, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." This episode reveals not only a rejection of the initial prohibition against other gods, but also an attempt to worship Yahweh through a visible image, thus violating the second commandment. The influence of Egyptian religion, where gods such as Apis were represented in the form of bulls, is evident. The Israelites were not necessarily worshiping another god, but rather attempting to worship the true God in an incorrect, syncretistic manner shaped by their previous cultural experience. The divine response to the incident of the golden calf was severe. Thousands died as punishment, and God threatened to abandon the people. "I will not come down among you, for you are a stiff-necked people, lest I consume you in the way." Only after Moses' intercession did God renew his covenant with Israel, though with conditions even more stringent regarding separation from idolatrous practice. The book of Leviticus, given shortly after these events, details the sacrificial system and the purity laws that would govern Israel's religious life. 5 main types of sacrifices were instituted: burnt offering, an offering completely consumed by fire representing total dedication; grain offering, agricultural produce expressing gratitude for divine provision; peace offering, part burn, part eaten, symbolizing communion with God; sin offering, atonement for unintentional sins; and guilt offering, reparation for harm caused to others. This elaborate system served multiple purposes. It taught about the holiness of God and the gravity of sin, which could only be atoned for by blood. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by the soul. It provided a means to restore communion with God when it was broken by sin. It established a rhythm of worship in the daily and annual life of the people through the cycle of feasts and sacrifices. The 3 great annual feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, required all Israelite men to present themselves at the central sanctuary. These pilgrimages not only reinforced national identity, but also kept alive the memory of God's great deeds, the deliverance from Egypt's Passover, the giving of the law, a Pentecost, and divine provision during the wilderness journey, tabernacles. In addition to feasts and sacrifices, the life of worship included the observance of the Sabbath, the sabbatical year, and the Jubilee year, institutions that emphasized God's lordship over time, the land, and social relations. The Sabbath, in particular, was a distinctive sign of the covenant. "You shall surely keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, so that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you." During the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, this system of worship was established and practiced, though not without deviations. The book of Amos suggests that sacrifices were neglected during that period. "Have you brought me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness for 40 years, O house of Israel?" The prophet Ezekiel indicates that idolatry was never completely abandoned. "They rebelled against me and would not listen to me. They did not cast off the idols of Egypt." The generation that entered the promised land under Joshua's leadership was born and raised in the wilderness, directly witnessing the divine presence and provision. After the initial conquest of Canaan, Joshua gathered the people in Shechem for a solemn renewal of the covenant. There he presented them with a challenge that would echo through the centuries. "Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The people's response was positive. "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. We too will serve the Lord, for he is our God." This commitment would be repeatedly tested in the following centuries as Israel faced the constant temptation to adopt the religious practices of the surrounding peoples. The period of the Judges was marked by a cycle of apostasy, oppression, repentance, and deliverance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That spiritual and political anarchy led to repeated alliances with the Canaanite gods, especially Baal, god of storm and fertility, and Astarte, goddess of fertility. Religious syncretism became common, with many Israelites attempting to worship both Yahweh and the local deities in the hope of securing abundant harvests and protection against enemies. The transition to monarchy brought new dimensions to worship in Israel. The first king, Saul, began well but soon showed a tendency to subordinate religion to political interests. Impatient during a military crisis, he usurped the priestly function by offering sacrifices, for which he was rebuked by Samuel. "You have acted foolishly by not keeping the commandment which the Lord your God commanded you. Now your kingdom shall not continue." In contrast, David, though far from perfect in his personal life, demonstrated genuine devotion to Yahweh. His first great act as the unifier of the kingdom was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, re-establishing the center of national worship. David danced with all his might before the Lord, an expression of spiritual joy that even perplexed his wife Michal, daughter of Saul, revealing differing attitudes toward worship even within the royal family. More significantly, David established new standards for praise and music in the cult. Being a musician and composer himself, he organized the Levites in rotations to minister continuously before the ark to celebrate and to praise and to magnify the Lord, the God of Israel. The Peace Psalms, many of which were composed by David, introduced a new dimension into Israelite worship, the poetic and musical expression of the deepest human emotions before God. Ranging from utter despair to exuberant joy, David's desire to build a permanent temple to replace the tabernacle was postponed due to his history of wars and bloodshed. But God promised that his son would carry out that project. In his later years, David prepared materials for the construction and organized priests and Levites for the future temple's service. Solomon inherited not only the stable and prosperous kingdom built by his father, but also his commitment to centralized worship of Yahweh. The construction of the temple in Jerusalem was the greatest undertaking of his reign, consuming 7 years and employing the finest artisans available, including workers sent by Hiram, king of Tyre. The dedication of the temple was a moment of unprecedented national and spiritual splendor when the priests placed the ark in the most holy place. The glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord in such a way that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. That visible manifestation of the divine presence legitimized the temple as the only authorized place for sacrificial worship, even though prayer could be offered anywhere. Always with Jerusalem in mind. In his magnificent dedication prayer, Solomon articulates a remarkably universal understanding of worship. Moreover, to the stranger who is not of your people of Israel, but who comes from a far country, because of your name, hear you in heaven, the dwelling place of your habitation, and do according to all that the stranger calls to you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name, to fear you as your people of Israel do. That recognition that the God of Israel could be worshipped by non-Israelites without necessarily having to become full proselytes through circumcision paved the way for the phenomenon of odd God-fearers. Gentiles who worshipped Yahweh without adopting all the distinctive practices of Judaism, especially circumcision. They formed a cultural and religious bridge between the Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds. Unfortunately, Solomon himself did not maintain the purity of worship his father had championed. His wives turned his heart after other gods. Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. He built high places, sanctuaries on elevated sites for the deities of his foreign wives, establishing a dangerous precedent that many later kings would follow. After Solomon's death and the division of the kingdom, religious syncretism intensified. Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom Israel, fearing that pilgrimages to Jerusalem would weaken his authority, established alternative religious centers at Dan and Bethel, with golden calves as representations of Yahweh. Behold your gods. O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. This official policy of syncretistic worship diverted the northern kingdom from the pure cult of Yahweh, although the calves were initially conceived as pedestals for the invisible God. Similar to the cherubim upon the ark, the line between symbol and idol soon blurred, especially among the common people. Even graver was the promotion of the worship of Baal during the reign of Ahab and his Phoenician wife Jezebel. They raised an altar to Baal in the house of Baal, which they had built in Samaria, and maintained hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah at state expense. This religious policy was not merely a tolerance of diverse beliefs, but a systematic replacement of worship of Yahweh with Canaanite cults. It was in this context of widespread apostasy that the prophet Elijah appeared, a staunch defender of exclusive worship of Yahweh. The confrontation on Mount Carmel between Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal represented the conflict between two incompatible religious systems. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him, challenged Elijah to the wavering people. When the fire from heaven consumed Elijah's sacrifice, after the humiliating failure of the prophets of Baal, the people momentarily acknowledged, "The Lord is God, the Lord is God." But that renewal was brief, and Elijah soon found himself forced to flee for his life, convinced that he was the last true worshiper in Israel. Divine correction to that despair came on Mount Horeb. Yet I have left in Israel 7,000 who have not bowed down to Baal. That revelation of a faithful remnant would be a recurring theme in the history of worship. Even in periods of widespread apostasy, God preserves those who maintain true faith, often in unexpected places and in ways unseen by the public eye. In the southern kingdom Judah, the religious situation was more stable due to the continuity of the Davidic dynasty and the presence of the temple in Jerusalem. Yet even there, the purity of worship was frequently corrupted. Kings such as Rehoboam allowed the construction of high places, pillars, and images of the cult of Asherah upon every high hill and under every leafy tree. Periods of reform alternated with periods of apostasy. King Asa removed the altars of strange gods and the high places. He broke down the pillars and cut the carved images. Jehoshaphat sent princes, Levites, and priests throughout the land to teach the law. Hezekiah restored the temple and celebrated a great Passover, inviting even the remnant of the northern tribes. Josiah, after the discovery of the Book of the Law, probably Deuteronomy, during the temple reforms, led the most comprehensive religious reform since the time of Moses, destroying all syncretistic places of worship and recentralizing worship in Jerusalem. However, these reforms rarely survived the kings who initiated them. The prophet Jeremiah, a contemporary of the last decades of the kingdom of Judah, lamented that the people had two evils. They had forsaken God, the fountain of living waters, and had hewed broken cisterns that cannot hold water, a powerful metaphor for the futility of idolatry compared to worship of the true God. The Babylonian exile, 586 to 536 BCE, represented an existential crisis for Israelite faith. With the temple destroyed and the people deported to a foreign land, how could they properly worship? A peace psalm from that period expresses the dilemma, how shall we sing the song of the Lord in a foreign land? That crisis forced a reformulation of worship. Lacking access to the sacrifices and rituals of the temple, new elements came to prominence: regular prayer 6 times a day, the reading and interpretation of the Scriptures, Sabbath observance, and communal meetings that eventually evolved into the synagogue system. Daniel opened the windows 3 times a day toward Jerusalem to pray, a pattern that later became the norm in Jewish practice. Ezekiel, prophesying among the exiles, received visions of an ideal temple that would be rebuilt in the future. Those visions kept alive the hope of restoration and preserved the memory of the details of sacrificial worship for generations who grew up never having seen the temple functioning. The second Isaiah, chapters 40-55, developed a profound theology regarding the meaning of the exile and the universal purpose of Israel. It is little that you are my servant to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back the remnant of Israel. I have also made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may be my salvation to the ends of the earth. The people's suffering had a redemptive purpose, to make them witnesses of the true God among the nations. After the return from exile under Cyrus's edict, the rebuilding of the temple became a priority, despite opposition from the Samaritans. Descendants of northern Israelites mixed with settlers brought by Assyria and economic difficulties, the Second Temple was completed in 516 BCE, allowing for the resumption of sacrifices. However, that temple was much less grand than its predecessor, and the Ark of the Covenant, lost during the destruction of Jerusalem, was not replaced. The most holy place remained empty, a tangible reminder that something of the former glory had been lost. Ezra, the scribe, led a religious reform that emphasized the study and strict observance of the law by publicly reading the Torah and explaining its meaning. He established a standard of scriptural interpretation that would be developed over the following centuries. His insistence on the separation of mixed marriages reflected the post-exilic concern for religious purity and the prevention of idolatrous influences. Nehemiah, governor of Judah under the Persian Empire, complemented that spiritual renewal with the physical reconstruction of Jerusalem, especially its walls. He also instituted practical reforms, such as the prohibition of commerce on the Sabbath and the regularization of the tithe system for the support of the Levites. The Persian period was relatively peaceful for the development of Jewish religious life. Under the Persian policy of religious tolerance, the Jews could practice their faith freely, as long as they remained politically loyal. Jewish communities flourished not only in Judah, but throughout the diaspora, Babylon, Egypt, Asia Minor, and eventually the Western Mediterranean, each developing its own interpretative traditions and practices, while maintaining the centrality of monotheism and the law. The conquest of the Middle East by Alexander the Great brought a new challenge to Jewish worship. Hellenism, with its attractive cultural and religious syncretism. The Hellenistic period saw the emergence of diverse currents within Judaism, representing different responses to that challenge. The Sadducees, associated with aristocratic priestly families, remained conservative regarding the temple ritual, but were relatively open to Greek cultural influences. They rejected oral traditions and beliefs not explicitly mentioned in the written Torah, such as the resurrection and the existence of angels. The Pharisees, emerging among the scribes, and lay teachers of the Torah, defended the oral law as a necessary complement to the written law, and developed interpretations that allowed faith to adapt to changing circumstances. They emphasized the sanctity of everyday life through the observance of ritual purity laws, even outside the context of the temple. The Essenes, mentioned by contemporary historians, but absent from the New Testament, withdrew to monastic communities such as Qumran. Considering the Jerusalem priesthood to be corrupt, they practiced an ascetic lifestyle and awaited a divine apocalyptic intervention that would purify the cult. The most acute crisis for Jewish worship came under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who in 167 BCE desecrated the temple, dedicating it to Zeus Olympios and sacrificing pigs upon the altar. He prohibited circumcision, Sabbath observance, and the possession of copies of the Scriptures, attempting to force the Hellenization of the Jews. That persecution provoked the Maccabean revolt, led by the priest Mattathias and his sons. After years of guerrilla warfare, they succeeded in reconquering Jerusalem and purifying the temple, an event commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah, the feast of dedication mentioned in John 10, verse 22. The brief period of independence under the Hasmonean dynasty saw the expansion of Jewish influence with the forced conversion of neighboring peoples, such as the Idumeans. When Pompey conquered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, incorporating Judea into the Roman Empire, he maintained the religious autonomy of the Jews, allowing the continuation of temple worship. Herod the Great, not Jewish by birth, but converted to Judaism, initiated a grand renovation of the temple, transforming it into one of the most impressive architectural complexes of the ancient world. Judaism, during that period, was far from monolithic. In addition to divisions between Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes, there were significant variations between Palestinian Judaism, which was more conservative, and Hellenistic Judaism, which was more open to philosophical synthesis, as exemplified by thinkers such as Philo of Alexandria. The Jewish diaspora had expanded enormously. Synagogues existed in virtually every major city of the Roman Empire and beyond, serving as centers of worship, study, and community. The translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, made the Scriptures accessible to the Greek-speaking world, attracting many Gentiles interested in ethical monotheism. Those God-fearers formed an outer circle around the Jewish communities. Gentiles who worshiped the God of Israel attended synagogues and observed some precepts such as the Sabbath and dietary restrictions, yet did not fully convert through circumcision. They constituted a cultural and religious bridge between the Jewish world and the Greco-Roman one. It was in this complex context that Jesus of Nazareth appeared, proclaiming, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." His message and ministry would provoke profound transformations in the understanding of true worship. Jesus was born into an observant Jewish family. He was circumcised on the 8th day, presented in the temple for the redemption of the firstborn, and his parents made the annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover. His first recorded visit to the temple at the age of 12 already demonstrated his special connection with the house of my father, as he called it. During his public ministry, Jesus regularly attended the synagogues where he read and interpreted the scriptures. He participated in the Jewish feasts in Jerusalem and significantly cleansed the temple on 2 occasions, driving out the merchants and money changers who had transformed the house of prayer for all nations into a den of thieves. Yet Jesus also introduced revolutionary elements into the understanding of worship. In his encounter with the Samaritan woman, he declared, "The hour is coming, and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for these are the ones that the Father seeks for his worshipers." God is spirit, and those who worship him must do so in spirit and in truth. That declaration relativized the importance of physical places of worship. Both the temple in Jerusalem and the rival sanctuary on Mount Gerizim, without, however, completely rejecting them. Internal but genuine, moved by the Spirit of God. Worship in truth is that which is aligned with divine revelation and free from hypocrisy. Jesus sharply criticized ostentatious religious practices performed to impress others. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who love to stand in the synagogues and on street corners to be seen by men. Likewise, he condemned the transformation of human traditions into divine requirements. They worship me in vain, teaching doctrines that are merely human precepts. On the other hand, he praised the simplicity and sincerity of heart, as in the case of the poor widow who gave 2 small coins to the temple treasury. She has given more than all of them. Or the repentant sinner who washed her feet with tears. She loved much. He prophesied the destruction of the temple, fulfilled in 70 AD, and its replacement by something greater. Destroy this sanctuary, and in 3 days I will rebuild it, referring to the sanctuary of his body. This identification between Jesus' body and the temple suggested a new understanding of the divine presence, not confined to a building, but incarnate in a person. At the Last Supper, Jesus transformed the Jewish Passover meal into a new commemorative ritual. Do this in remembrance of me. The bread and the wine came to symbolize his body and blood offered as a sacrifice for all. This new ritual, which would become central in Christian worship, maintained continuity with the Jewish Passover, while reinterpreting its meaning in light of Jesus' imminent death and resurrection. In the letters of Paul, we see the development of these ideas. The early Christians, initially all Jewish, continued to frequent the temple and the synagogues, but also gathered in homes for the breaking of bread and prayers. Paul describes the church as a temple of God and the bodies of believers as the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit, extending Jesus' metaphor of the body as a sanctuary. The Epistle to the Hebrews